June 5th, 1942, the day the myth died. The day the Japanese Empire watched its illusion of naval supremacy go up in flames. Carrier by carrier, deck by deck, soul by soul. At dawn, they still believed they ruled the Pacific. By nightfall, they knew. The trap they thought they'd set had snapped shut on them instead. And no one could quite explain how it had all gone so wrong, so fast. If you feel the weight of history and the pride of those who stood when it mattered, subscribe. This is where America's courage is remembered, one battle at a time. For carriers, the pride of the Imperial Navy, the cornerstone of their ambitions from Hawaii to Australia, reduced to burning wreckage in less than a day. Not weeks, not months, not after a drawn-out campaign of attrition. One day, this wasn't just a battle lost. This was the unraveling of everything they had built, everything they had believed. For the Americans, it was the miracle at Midway. For the Japanese, it was the moment of reckoning. Admiral Nagumo stared at the sky, unable to comprehend how American dive bombers had found them first. He had launched every scout plane, followed every procedure. He played it by the book, but the book didn't matter anymore. The Americans weren't playing by it. 3,000 miles from Tokyo, from minutes of chaos in the sky, ended 20 years of Japanese naval doctrine. Carrier warfare was supposed to be their edge. They had written the manual, refined it, perfected it at Pearl Harbor. But at Midway, the Americans threw the manual into the sea. They found the Japanese carriers before the Japanese had even confirmed the location of the U.S. fleet. Nagumo had a choice that morning: arm his planes with bombs for land attacks, or torpedoes for ships. He chose bombs, then reversed the order mid-morning. That single hesitation, that moment of indecision, cost him the war. His carriers were caught in the middle of rearming. Hangars packed with bombs and fuel lines. Deck crews scrambling. Planes grounded. Then came the scream of American dauntless dive bombers. And then, fire. First, the Kaga, engulfed in flames from stem to stern. Deck melting, bombs cooking off. Men leaping overboard into the slick Black Sea. Then the Akagi, flagship of the fleet, Nagumo's own command center, hit dead center by a single 1,000-pound bomb. One was enough. The Soryu went next. 3 direct hits, explosions ripping through her armored belly like paper. She burned so hot her steel twisted in real time. And the Hiryu, the last hope, struck later that afternoon. She had managed to launch a counterattack. She'd sent waves of torpedo bombers that crippled the USS Yorktown. It was a flicker of hope, a dying breath. But the Americans found her too. And when they did, they didn't hesitate. For American bombs ended her too. She sank before dawn the next day. For carriers lost, 2,200 men gone, hundreds of planes destroyed. A third of the Japanese Navy's frontline air power erased in 24 hours. But worse than the losses was the silence. Tokyo received no good news. Only shock, only death, only burning hulls swallowed by the Pacific. Admiral Yamamoto, mastermind of Pearl Harbor, had staked everything on Midway. He'd planned a complex feint at the Aleutians. He'd split his fleet across thousands of miles. He believed the Americans would react slowly, predictably, fearfully. Instead, they were waiting. U.S. Navy codebreakers had cracked the Japanese plans weeks before. They knew Midway was the target. They knew the carriers would come. So they set the real trap. 3 American flat tops, Enterprise, Hornet, Yorktown. Outnumbered, outgunned, but positioned, ready. The irony was brutal. Pearl Harbor had taught the Americans the price of complacency. Midway taught the Japanese the price of arrogance. In Tokyo, disbelief turned to dread. Officers gathered around maps that no longer made sense. Fleet positions that should have brought victory had delivered only destruction. They had underestimated American resolve, underestimated their speed, their intelligence, their nerve. Everything they thought they knew about the American war machine was wrong. They believed the U.S. was still reeling from Pearl Harbor. They didn't understand what Pearl Harbor had actually done. It had awakened an industrial monster, one that could lose a carrier today and have 2 more under construction tomorrow. One that would bleed, yes, but never back down. The Imperial Navy had been fighting a 6-month war. The The Americans were preparing for a 6-year one. And at Midway, the timelines collided. Japan's illusion of dominance shattered. The carriers lost at Midway weren't just steel and smoke. They were symbols of initiative, of superiority, of invincibility. And when they sank, so did the myth. The battle was over, but the war had changed. From now on, the Japanese Navy would fight on its back foot, retreating, reacting, reduced. No more surprise offensives. No more unchecked advances across the Pacific. After Midway, every mile gained would be a mile clawed back by blood and fire. Every island, every atoll, every reef would become a battleground. And the Americans, they would not stop. They had proven they could strike. They had proven they could outthink. They had proven they could kill the heart of the Kido Butai in one day. And they had only just begun. In the days that followed, Japanese admirals reviewed after-action reports in grim silence. Some refused to believe the numbers. Some searched for scapegoats. But a few understood. This wasn't a fluke. This wasn't luck. This was the beginning of the end. For the rest of the war, Japan would never again launch a major offensive in the Pacific. They'd lost more than ships. They'd lost momentum. They'd lost initiative. They'd lost faith. The Americans, on the other hand, had found it. At Coral Sea, they had stopped the advance. At Midway, they had turned the tide. The myth of Japanese naval supremacy died with the flames on those carrier decks. And in its place, a new reality emerged. That the Pacific belonged to whoever could build faster, think sharper, strike harder. And from that moment forward, everyone knew it would be the Americans. Because while Japan had built a navy, America had built a machine. And that machine had just switched on. The shadow of Midway would follow every Japanese admiral to the end of the war. It was the moment they stopped asking if they would lose and started wondering when. The beginning of their empires didn't come with a bang in Tokyo or a bomb over Hiroshima. It came with 4 bombs dropped from the sky. June 5th, 1942, the day the fire rose, the day the myth drowned, the day the Pacific slipped from Japanese hands and never returned. The shock did not wear off. Not that day, not that week, not for the rest of the war. In every command tent and strategy hall across the Japanese Empire, the numbers from Midway echoed like a death toll. For fleet carriers gone, Kaga, Akagi, Soryu, Hiryu, names that once inspired fear now whispered like eulogies. Hundreds of trained aviators gone. Entire squadrons vaporized. The most experienced flight crews in the Imperial Navy, men who had trained since the 1930s, either burned alive on their ships or drowned in the vast indifference of the Pacific. They weren't just names on a roster. They were the heart of Japanese air power, the core of its offensive edge, and they couldn't be replaced. Not quickly, not in a war that was only growing more brutal by the week. At headquarters in Tokyo, the tone turned from disbelief to dread. Intelligence officers pored over intercepted signals, trying to explain how the Americans had turned the tables. The answer was there, buried in the codes, in the transmissions they had dismissed as impossible. American codebreakers had cracked Jan 25, the Imperial Navy's most secure communication network. For weeks, they had been listening, watching, mapping every move of the supposedly invisible Japanese fleet. The idea that the Americans had known the exact date, time, and location of the attack shattered any remaining illusions of Japanese superiority in information warfare. The empire that had mastered surprise at Pearl Harbor had just been outmaneuvered by the very enemy it thought too slow, too clumsy, too weak to fight back. What stung even worse was the fact that they had been warned by their own doubts, their own internal critics. Rear Admiral Agaki had expressed concern over the complexity of Yamamoto's Midway plan, the dispersion of forces, the overconfidence baked into every assumption. Yet those concerns were buried under layers of arrogance, tradition, and the unshakable belief that the Imperial Navy could not be beaten. They had looked at the Americans and seen amateurs. Now, they were realizing too late that those amateurs were learning faster than anyone expected and fighting like their survival depended on it. On the decks of the surviving Japanese ships, the mood turned grim. Sailors who had once spoken with pride about Japan's divine mission now stood in silence, eyes scanning the horizon for aircraft that could appear from nowhere. Every shadow in the sky became a threat. Every wave a reminder of how quickly steel could become a tomb. The fleet that had once roamed the Pacific unchallenged was now forced into a defensive posture, protecting what remained instead of taking what they wanted. The idea of another bold strike, Australia, Hawaii, even the West Coast, was abandoned. Not discussed, not feasible. The offensive war was over. From Midway forward, Japan would be on the run. But Midway wasn't just a tactical disaster. It was a spiritual collapse. The doctrine of Kantai Kessen, the decisive battle philosophy that had guided Japanese naval thought for decades, had been tested and destroyed. The idea that one climactic confrontation between capital fleets could settle the fate of empires had been the North Star of Japan's maritime strategy since before World War I. It shaped how they built their navy, how they trained their officers, how they waged war. And Midway had been designed to be that battle, their moment of validation. Instead, it proved the very theory false. The decisive battle had occurred, and they had lost it. For Admiral Yamamoto, the loss was more than operational. It was personal. He had gambled everything: his strategy, his carriers, his pilots, his reputation. He had told his peers that if Japan did not win within the first 6 months of the war, they would lose. June 5, 1942, marked the end of those 6 months. His prediction had become a prophecy. And now, even he could see the long war stretching out before them, one they were not built to survive. He had feared waking the American giant. At Midway, he saw the giant's eyes open. The Americans, for their part, seized the moment. They knew what they had done. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of the Pacific Fleet, had taken a risk by positioning his carriers northeast of Midway based on intelligence and instinct. That risk paid off in history-changing fashion. The coordination between codebreakers at Pearl Harbor, aviators on the flat tops, and the commanders who trusted their gut over their fear created a rare alignment of skill and luck. The Americans had struck first, struck hard, and struck decisively. And it wasn't just a victory, it was a message. The U.S. Navy was not only capable of stopping Japan's advance, it was ready to push back, and they would push. Island by island, chain by chain, atolls that had once been stepping stones for Japanese conquest became death traps. Guadalcanal followed just weeks later. The Solomons turned into a meat grinder. Each battle eroded more of Japan's remaining air power, bled more of their fleet, exposed the limits of their supply lines and industry. But it all started at Midway. Every future Japanese defeat could trace its roots back to that morning, to those minutes when dive bombers plunged from the sky and forever changed the course of the Pacific War. Midway also exposed the brutal mathematics of industrial war. Japan could not afford the loss of 4 carriers. America could. The Japanese had spent over a decade building those ships, training those pilots. The Americans replaced Yorktown within months. They launched new Essex-class carriers every few weeks. They trained waves of new pilots in a system that scaled. Japan trained artists. America trained machines. The empire had crafted an elite navy. The United States built an endless one. The contrast was devastating. By 1943, Japan was cobbling together carriers from converted passenger liners. Training time for pilots dropped from 2 years to 6 months, then 3, then less. Quality evaporated. The aces of 1942 were dead. Their replacements were boys, barely able to land on a deck, sent against veterans of Coral Sea and Midway who now knew exactly how to win. The skies of the Pacific, once patrolled by Zeros in proud formations, were increasingly filled with fireballs and parachutes. But the psychological impact of Midway was even deeper. The aura of the Imperial Navy had cracked. Before Midway, Japanese naval officers spoke with absolute certainty. They believed in victory not just as a goal, but as an inevitability. After Midway, that certainty died. Planning sessions became more cautious, debates more heated. Confidence gave way to calculation. And always, the memory of June 5th lingered. Every operation after was haunted by the fear of another ambush, another dive bomber, another carrier turned to scrap in an afternoon. The American public, once desperate for any good news, found in Midway a rallying cry. Headlines screamed of revenge. Radio broadcasts replayed the victory again and again. The name Midway itself became symbolic, not just a battle, but a turning point, a signal that the war was no longer just about survival. Now it was about victory, total victory, no negotiation, no compromise. The Japanese hadn't just lost ships, they had lost the initiative, and the will of their enemy hardened into steel. And back in Japan, the truth of Midway was carefully hidden. The public was told of a great success. Details were censored. The emperor was misled. For months, even junior officers were not told the full scope of the disaster. What the Japanese had not understood, and what they could no longer deny, was that their war was not one of genius strategy, but of raw numbers, of logistics, a mass, a better ship, bigger, faster, packed with more planes. By 1943, a new Essex carrier was sliding off American shipyards every 2 months. In the time it took Japan to repair one cruiser, the U.S. built 2 carriers for destroyers and launched 1,000 aircraft. Japan had bet on the quick kill. Midway proved there would be no such thing. Now, it was a war of attrition, and the clock was on America's side. For the Japanese high command, the disaster triggered a quiet but irreversible shift. No longer were strategies centered on expansion. Now, there were desperate calculations for how long they could delay the inevitable. Yamamoto ordered new defenses, fallback lines, layered fortresses of coral and concrete across the Central Pacific. Every island turned into a trap. But he knew, deep down he knew, no amount of concrete could stop the waves of steel that were coming. Midway also shattered another illusion, that Japanese air power could dominate the skies indefinitely. In the early months of the war, the Mitsubishi A6M0 had been untouchable. Lightweight, agile, with unparalleled range, it slaughtered clumsy Allied aircraft in dogfights from Burma to the Philippines. But at Midway, its weaknesses became apparent. It lacked armor, lacked self-sealing fuel tanks, and more importantly, it could not match the damage output of American dive bombers or intercept multiple coordinated attacks. It was built to dominate a war Japan could no longer fight. American pilots, once green, untested, and outclassed, had found their stride. The lessons of Coral Sea and Midway created a new breed of naval aviator, aggressive, disciplined, fearless. Pilots like Wade McCluskey, who led the fateful dive on the Kaga, or Richard Best, who dropped the bomb that crippled the Akagi, weren't just lucky. They were competent, bold, deadly. The Imperial Navy's air superiority vanished not in a single battle, but in 1,000 engagements, skirmishes, and sorties that followed. The advantage was gone. The Zero would never rule the skies again. But perhaps the most catastrophic effect of Midway was psychological. The aura of Japanese dominance had been ruptured. Before Midway, the U.S. Navy had fought on the defensive, struggling to regroup, afraid to stretch too far. After Midway, they moved forward with confidence. They had bloodied the Kido Butai. They had crippled the sword that once cut across half the Pacific. And in that moment, they realized the truth. Japan could be beaten. Momentum, once firmly in Japan's grip, began to shift. Operation Galvanic in the Gilberts. Operation Flintlock in the Marshalls. Each one bringing the war closer to the Japanese homeland. Naval task forces grew larger, faster, more brutal. Japanese positions were pounded by aircraft, shelled by battleships, and then overrun by Marines who refused to yield. At Tarawa, at Kwajalein, at Saipan, American casualties were high, but Japanese defenders were annihilated to the last man. No surrender, no quarter, only ash and silence. Yamamoto himself would not survive to see the full unraveling. Less than a year after Midway, American cryptographers tracked his flight path over Bougainville. In a precise ambush, U.S. P-38s shot him down. The architect of Pearl Harbor and Midway's disastrous plan died in flames, his body found still clutching his katana. Symbolic. The sword that had once cut so deep into the Pacific now lay still, rusting in jungle rot. But Yamamoto's death changed nothing. The machinery of American war had fully activated. By 1944, it was churning out B-29 super fortresses and Liberty ships by the hundreds. U.S. carrier groups turned into floating cities, launching endless waves of sorties. The Mariana Islands fell. Then the Philippines. In the Battle of the Philippine Sea, the so-called Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, Japanese naval aviation was all but wiped out. Hundreds of aircraft shot down in a single day. Veteran pilots replaced by undertrained teenagers. The once legendary Japanese naval air arm ceased to exist in any meaningful form. Midway had been the turning point, but the road after was paved with the remnants of Japan's ambition. Iwo Jima, Okinawa, operations so costly, so savage, that entire divisions vanished in the process. The kamikaze tactic, once unthinkable, became mainstream doctrine. Japan no longer had the ships, the oil, or the pilots to mount a traditional counteroffensive. Their navy was rotting in ports, trapped by lack of fuel and American blockades. Destroyers became floating batteries. Battleships, once the pride of the fleet, became stationary gun platforms. And as Japan dug deeper into defense, the Americans prepared for invasion. Operation Downfall, a two-part plan to land on the Japanese home islands, expected to cost up to 1 million Allied lives and far more Japanese. But never came to that, because on August 6th and 9th, 1945, the new face of American warfare revealed itself over Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The atomic age had arrived. Japan surrendered days later, and with it, the empire that had dared to challenge the United States across the Pacific collapsed into rubble. The rising sun was extinguished. But the seeds of that collapse had been planted years earlier in the waters around a tiny atoll few Americans had heard of before 1942. Midway was not just a battle. It was a reckoning. It was the moment when Japanese admirals, masters of sea power, heirs to a centuries-old warrior tradition, realized they had underestimated their enemy. Not just in numbers, not just in technology, but in will, in ingenuity, in sheer, unrelenting resolve. They had believed in victory as a divine right. The Americans proved that victory had to be earned in fire and blood and sacrifice. The Japanese carriers that sank that day were more than ships. They were temples to a fading dream. A dream of swift conquest, of glory reclaimed, of empire restored. When they burned, they took that dream with them to the bottom of the sea. And in their place, a new power rose from the wreckage. The United States Navy had arrived, not as a reaction force, not as a coastal defense arm, but as the dominant maritime force on Earth. Its planes now ranged across entire oceans. Its carriers projected power thousands of miles from home. Its fleets moved like nations, with the force of history behind them. The Pacific, once a theater of Japanese expansion, became an American highway. And the admirals who had once charted Japan's unstoppable rise now sat in smoky rooms, eyes sunken, shoulders bent, watching as their maps turned red and their orders turned to ash. June 5th, 1942, was the day everything changed. It was not the final blow. It was the fracture, the instant the foundation cracked, the moment they knew they would still fight, they would still kill, they would still bleed America at every beachhead they could, but they no longer believed they could win. And that, more than ships, more than aircraft, more than bombs, was what the Americans had truly taken at Midway. Their belief, their certainty, their soul. When the sun set on that day, the Pacific still churned with smoke and fire. Lifeboats bobbed across an endless ocean. Oil slicks caught the light like molten rainbows. And beneath it all, down where no sailor would ever breathe again, lay the wrecks of Japan's best. Silent now, lifeless, and with them, the last true hope of Japanese victory. The myth was gone, and the war would never be the same.